All right, howdy everybody. Hopefully this is a review for most of you, but for those of you missing a little of the info, I'm going to review it for you. We're calling this "How to Prepare for a Debate." We're using the Great Lakes to practice the skill of understanding point of view. So we're going to see two sides to understanding the issues surrounding the Great Lakes ecosystem. We're going to talk about ways that they're being harmed and also ways that they're being protected. So the first issue we're going to take a look at is pollution. Generally, when we think of pollution, we're thinking about things going into the air or things going into the water or onto the land. In this case, we'll be taking a look at the first point of view, which is that of the doomer. They think that the Great Lakes, they're in trouble, and here's a few reasons why. In terms of pollution, what we have is one is non-point source solution. This is still a serious problem. Non-point source pollution is that comes from runoff from rain from places like farms and other things with toxic chemicals that could catch in the rain and go into rivers and eventually into the Great Lakes. We've got toxic waste dumps that contain poisons that get in the water. That's another issue that is surrounding pollution and the health of the Great Lakes. We've got pollution in the air, like mercury. This still pollutes the lakes, so any air pollution actually can get into the Great Lakes ecosystem, as well as toxic sediments and other. They're another source of pollution. So what's happening ultimately is that some people believe that the water can catch fire. It did in the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, and here we see old SpongeBob trying to put out the fire in his house. But then we've got the other side of the argument. We've got the boosters. They point out that the Cuyahoga River that stopped being flammable, so that's getting better. We've got algae growth in the lakes. Ultimately, was reduced. So we have those kinds of things happening that the boosters are like, they're getting better, and here's some evidence. The lakes turned blue again with reduction of algae growth, and then you've got PCBs and DDT. These are chemicals. They've declined in the food chain, so ultimately the laws that banned those things are showing up in a decline in the food chain. And then you've got bald eagles, and ultimately they've been able to make a comeback. So these people say, hey, jump in, swim. The Great Lakes are still great and getting better. Then we've got habitat loss. That's our next category. We've got the boosters' point of view. They believe timber companies are using better practices than they did back in the day when there was actually a lot of forests being cut down. The Great Lakes forests are now expanding ultimately instead of shrinking, so they're starting to make a comeback. We see the wetlands. They're being protected at this point in time. You've got public and private groups are creating nature preserves on existing wetlands, so that's ultimately preserving the homes of specific animals. And then you've got builders in a lot of areas are required to restore wetlands. They replace what they destroy. So when they're building buildings and houses and things like that and ultimately destroy the habitat and wetlands of animals, they're being required to fix them. So you see a guy like this, his home is, he's feeling pretty good about a lot of the things that have happened to save his habitat. And then you've got the doomers who believe it's a lot worse than what boosters would say. The doomers say almost half of the original forests in the Great Lakes are gone due to huge amounts of forest industry coming in and taking out all the trees. Then you've got more people are moving to the Great Lakes and they're putting pressure on the habitat. So the more people you have, the more houses are built, the more habitats are being compromised. Then you've got more than half the Great Lakes wetlands ultimately have disappeared. So that means in terms of habitat loss, half of wetlands where birds and frogs and lots of other animals live are ultimately gone. So here's an example of how forestry and logging works. And the doomers would have you say that this is making things worse, not better. So there is information about habitat loss. The last one is invasive species. We've got a couple of things here. We'll talk about the boosters' point of view first off. They've ultimately said that in terms of keeping invasive species out, these species that are not native to the Great Lakes, there's regulations, laws set in place to protect invasive species from coming in. They've got barriers to keep invasive species out. They've got electric fences in rivers to stop things like the Asian carp, which are a threat. Governments have introduced new species like the Pacific salmon, and that's helped to control invasive species. So they've actually brought in an invasive species to help with the invasive species problem. So they're seeing that that's actually working. The alewife numbers are down, another invasive species that has wreaked havoc on the Great Lakes. And then native fish ultimately are beginning to recover. So when you think about invasive species, they're saying things are better, everybody's happy, the fish are happy, the Great Lakes are happy. So then we've got the other point of view, which is the doomers. The doomers, they are like, how can we say it's getting better? There's more than 170 invasive species already in the Great Lakes. So getting better needs to happen a lot more because the doomers are like, there's a lot of invasive species. And the invasive species, they've already damaged the Great Lakes ecosystem. They've done a lot of harm, so we need to do more. And then you've got things like the Asian carp, which threaten to invade the Great Lakes. And this right now would be the number one biggest threat to what's happening in the Great Lakes. So are you okay with the possibility of this happening, or do we need more to prevent the possibility of Asian carp invasion? Ay, ay, ay. So there you have it. Ultimately, the three categories. These would be some of the answers that you could use if you've got other evidence. That is absolutely fantastic, and I hope to hear it in our upcoming debate. We're going to take a look at some of the rules for the debate, and we'll move on from there. But here you have 2 points of view talking about pollution, habitat loss, and invasive species from the point of view of the boosters versus the doomers. Hopefully you've got some of your information and you're ready to go. All right.